Now, very, very happy to say we're welcoming back to the show Mr. Tris Dixon. He has covered boxing for over 20 years and he has spent the last 4 working on this book here, which I'll hold up to those of you who are streaming: Damage, the Untold Story of Brain Trauma in Boxing. And it's been out for the last couple of months. Tris, I'm so sorry. I've been meaning to get around to you for a while. And I wanted to read the book before I actually brought you on. So that was kind of half of the delay as well. What kind of reaction have you received? Not so much from the non-boxing world, but I'm curious, within boxing, this has the potential to start a conversation. Some people don't really want to gather much momentum. So what kind of a reaction?
Well, critically within boxing, I think it's been quite well received, in terms of the reviews and that kind of stuff. And I think people have some people knew it was a subject that needed addressing, and some people weren't aware of how serious it was and how big an issue it was, and have been blown away by the content of the book. So there's that. I think for me, in terms of being an author, and as you say there, sort of dedicating 4 years of my life to the book, is I did always sort of say this, and it was a bit of a cliche, but I did say if it helped one person, it's done its job. And from the messages I've received from a handful of fighters, a few trainers, and I mean grassroots trainers as well as a couple of pro trainers, and some parents, it's done its job in the sense that it's raised some awareness about the long-term dangers of boxing. And it's caused people to change habits, change routines, and think again about what they do and how they do it. So in many ways, it's already mission accomplished, because I know it's already allowing some people to live better lives than they might have otherwise lived down the line.
Because in some ways, when we talk about the book being Damaged, the Untold Story of Brain Trauma in Boxing, in other ways, it is a very told story. And what I mean by that is that there has been an awareness of this association between boxing and brain damage of some kind or another for a long time. Like, in a very fascinating way, you introduce us to Dr. Harrison Martland, who was a doctor in the 20s. And in 1928, New York, he published a medical paper which for the first time brought the phrase punch drunk into a medical context, I suppose. He wrote in the Journal of the American Medical Association. So he established punch drunk syndrome in a medical context. But of course, that was long used before by the boxing fraternity. This didn't shock the boxing fraternity in any way whatsoever. But 1928 is significant in that way. And that's where punch drunk kind of made its way into fairly common use medically.
Yeah, you're right. That was sort of the ground zero of the medical lexicon, and sort of and how it was used in terminology. And it's funny because I was just speaking to just a casual sports fan yesterday, and we were talking about CTE, which is chronic traumatic encephalopathy, and we were talking about the concussion crisis in the NFL. And we were talking about behaviors and stuff, and he said, "Oh, it's a bit like punch drunk syndrome." And I said, "That's exactly what it is. That's what it is." So, when people look at the NFL and what's happened to some of the American footballers over time and in retirement and stuff, there's a very familiar pattern there in terms of what we've had in boxing since the turn of the 20th century. So, we've had our extreme cases, we've had our Mike Websters and people like that, but they've sort of generally flown under the radar, and there's been very little understanding about what's actually happening to these guys. And just to join the dots, as it were, punch drunk syndrome became dementia pugilistica in the late 1930s, and then it was changed to CTE. So it's the same thing. So these football players are technically punch drunk, but it's obviously called CTE, and that's a much more accepting phraseology. And I wish it was used more in boxing now, because I will still read the boxing press and boxing writers who still write about punch drunk and certainly dementia pugilistica, thinking it's scientific. And just to get a little bit panicky about the whole thing, dementia pugilistica was stopped being used because dementia wasn't always present in the fighters who were suffering from it. So it was a bit of a technicality there. So that's why it's changed to CTE, which chronic is obviously long-term, trauma is damage, and encephalopathy is to the brain. So that's why you wind up with CTE.
Mm. And what the book does very well is, amongst other things, charts that journey of understanding from Dr. Harrison Martland in 1928 through to Dr. Bennett O'Malley and Mike Webster, as you say, and the NFL and CTE. And you can see the understandings and the assumptions change over time. So, for instance, when Martland first talked about being punch drunk, there was an assumption then this was very much an affliction of second-rate fighters for a long time, that they were used basically for training purposes as sparring partners, that they were being knocked down several times a day. So the real top dogs wouldn't suffer with it. And I suppose about the 1970s, I think you say in the book, most studies had made this look outdated because there was increasingly an understanding that the best fighters were often the bravest, the most durable. They were often involved in even fights as opposed to being knocked out pretty quickly. They were, punching against very accurate, powerful punchers, and so taking a lot of punishment. And I think Claude Abrams, boxing news editor, made that point. So about the 1970s, this had stopped being seen as a lesser boxer issue.
To an extent, but it's a very interesting point that you make there, Joe, and it's a really important point to talk about. Yes, you're right. In terms of the medical papers, I think people are starting to realize that it's happening. It's a lot more widespread, and it's just not just happening to the journeyman, the sparring partners, or guys that weren't very good. But what did stay and therefore manifest itself in the sport was the negativity that basically it happened to people who weren't very good, or you got hit a lot, and so that sort of was a stain on people. And it's that sort of medical that sort of terminology has been used as in a negative way, and is still used to this day. I mean, I think I quote it at the end of the book, but Donald Trump was lashing out at Robert De Niro when they were having one of their high profile spats when Trump was in the White House. And he said he's the most punch drunk actor I know, of De Niro, who'd obviously played Jake LaMotta in Raging Bull. And so obviously it was used in a negative way. And obviously we're not exposed to that with American football. These guys are still heroes who go out on their shield, but for fighters, they've sort of been mocked and ridiculed over the years. But you're right. I mean, I guess by the 70s, you couldn't deny it any longer, certainly by the 80s, because when you look at some of the best fighters of all time, you look at Henry Armstrong, you look at Sugar Ray Robinson, you look at Joe Louis, you look at Muhammad Ali, they all suffered neurologically down the line. There were links to, and obviously now we know the links to Alzheimer's, to dementia, to Parkinson's, to ALS, and so forth. And all of those guys suffered, and they were the best to ever do it. Even someone like Willie Pep or Wilfred Benitez, defensive magicians, Wilfred Benitez couldn't feed or clothe himself by his late 30s. And Willie Pep passed away suffering with Alzheimer's in an old person's home.
That is an interesting point you make about the stigma, i.e. boxers don't want to be associated with being punch drunk, because it does suggest on their part that they took a lot of punishment because they might not have been very good.
Yeah, and I think that's a big thing now, and I still think that's part of the denial. In fact, there's a chapter in there where I speak to Aaron Pryor's widow, and in fact to Joey Giambra, one of the middleweights from the 50s and 60s, speak to his children, and they were very adamant, saying that their relatives, so Joey Giambra and Aaron Pryor respectively, didn't want the tag of being punch drunk because it meant you weren't very good. And obviously clearly that wasn't the case. It's just there's only so much the brain can stand over years and years of abuse.
I must say, I was about to say looking forward to, but that's the wrong phrase, I think, when you're talking about something so serious or upsetting. But I was definitely eager to read about your take on Ali. I mean, he's this central figure in boxing of the 20th century, and obviously so synonymous with the damage that boxing does. And it was really fascinating, the few pages on Ali. Like, for instance, we don't know for sure, you can't say for sure if Ali had CTE. It seems the family don't want to put that label on him for whatever reason. They don't want him to be the poster boy for the ills of boxing.
Sure, and you can understand that. And there's quite a few fighters in there. And Ali was a guy, his voice is in the book in the sense that I spoke to his biographer, Thomas Hauser, who said, Ali would say, he wouldn't change a thing, and he wouldn't trade the second part of his life for the first part of his life, and that kind of stuff. And there's plenty of voices in there. The thing with Ali was interesting because me, as a young boxer and a young fight fan, I was blinded by the thing, thinking it's Parkinson's. It's a law of averages. You know, look at Michael J. Fox, and you know, it could happen to anyone, and all the rest of it. And you kind of ignore the facts that this is a guy who, you know, boxed on far too long. And you know, there's another can of worms in the Ali thing, in the sense that, you know, he couldn't get a license in America so his last fight was in the Bahamas against Trevor Berbick, which, you know, boxing's filled with these loopholes, which I try and address in the book, where you know, if a fighter can't get a license somewhere, someone else will have him somewhere down the line. Someone will want to make a buck on his name. That's kind of what happened with Ali. But yeah, you're right. And you know, there's a few voices in the book. It's hard to say, but you know, critical of Ali, and you know, no one wants to be critical of him, and you can understand. You know, so you know, obviously Ali was massively vain, and wouldn't have wanted that negative stigma, saying, "Oh yeah, I got this because I got hit so often," because you weren't supposed to be able to hit him. Even though obviously we know that some of his sparring camps and the rope-a-dope and all the rest of it, he invited the abuse. You know, in the latter stages of his career, certainly. But yeah, there are some negative voices in there towards Ali, with people saying he could have done more for boxing in terms of raising awareness about CTE and helping old fighters and that. But they went, you know, it's a tough one, isn't it, Joe? Because they went the Parkinson's route, and they've created so much awareness for that, and they've opened up centers, and they've got charities, and you know, that, you know, they've done so much in that way. But in terms of boxing, perhaps it would have been the voice that really triggered change in boxing, and could have helped, you know, create some sort of federal reform where fighters couldn't go through the loopholes that are through, and so forth. Yeah.
Yes. And so CTE can only be established through autopsy. So the family have never done that. Is that right?
I don't believe so. I don't believe so. But yes, I mean, in terms of it being identified through autopsy, yes, that's true. But there are certain cases where, you know, for example, Mickey Ward, who was the crowd pleasing welterweight from the 90s and noughties, really had those three fantastic fights with Arturo Gatti. So Mickey's been diagnosed with having CTE. That's because they know what he's been through in his life and the amount of concussions he's had, or, you know, roughly how many concussions he's had, the hard fights, the wars he's had, and that kind of stuff. And because of his symptoms, so his symptoms now are short-term memory loss, mood swings, and different things that he didn't have years ago. So so they've sort of been bold enough to diagnose him, saying, look, you know, we think you're going to have it. And Mickey's donating his brain to the brain bank in Boston. So he's working with these guys hand in hand, and that's great, you know, because that's what these fighters need to do. They need to, you know, I'd be worried for Mickey, who I know well. I'd be worried for him if he didn't know what was going on, because, you know, I've met fighters down the line who are homeless or really struggling, and they don't know that there's anything wrong with them, and they're not sure why they're not functioning the same way that they used to, and that kind of stuff. And it's a very scary situation when they don't have the knowledge of what's happening to them, or having it, or they've got no one to look after them as well.
Yeah. What's fascinating with Ali is, I mean, you lay it out in various ways. One of them being that you say Ali started probably taking punches aged 12 in 1954, and his final fight, that one against Berbick in 1981. So that's a long time, obviously, and 61 pro fights. And you hark back to Atlanta, where the depth of his decline shocked a worldwide audience when he was lighting the Olympic flame. And you talked to a couple of interesting people around the camp, namely the doctor. Is it Pacheco? Is that the pronunciation?
Yeah, so Dr. Ferdy Pacheco. Yeah, I mean, I never got to speak to Ferdy, but yeah, I mean, Ferdy was adamant. I mean, he left the camp and he was seen as a pariah afterwards.
Yes.
I think it was after Muhammad fought, I want to say it was the Ernie Shavers fight. Maybe it was just before that.
Yeah, it was 1978, and he left in protest effectively because he said, this is just doing him no good. Writings on the wall, effectively, yeah. And I mean, he made a brilliant point about how when Ali went into exile and re-emerged, his legs had gone, you know, and so he was saying, well, he's lost the first line of defense. And then he discovered what he said was a very good thing and also a terrible thing, the terrible being for his health, the good thing being for his career. He discovered that he could really take a punch.
Yeah. Yeah, there was, you know, Ferdy was great with lines. Like I said, he became a pariah in the camp. And it's a tough one, isn't it? Because, you know, Angelo Dundee, who was training Ali, was seen as a bit of a bystander because he was there. You know, some people say he was riding on the coattails of Ali, but also in his position, what should he have done? Should he have let a hired gun come in his place who didn't know Ali as well, who couldn't have protected him? It's a tough one, isn't it? He probably felt he was in the best position to look after him as best as possible. And obviously by then, I think Ferdy was right. The damage had been done by then as well. But it's a very tough position because, I was speaking to someone who looked after a champion a guy who was a champion in the late 70s and who was shot and washed up in the early 90s. And I was speaking to his old coach the other day, and this was a coach who'd just taken him in, and he was just trying to get him fights to try and get him money, because the problem is with a lot of these fighters. So say this fighter was offered £1,000 for a fight, or $1,000 for a fight, which would have been top end for him by that point. How is he going to make that in the real world? That would take weeks of, laboring or painting or whatever. These guys think, if I can get 5 or 6 of these paydays together, maybe I'll be in line for another shot, or, certainly I'll be a few $1,000s richer. And it's all they know. And I think this is a big part of where boxing goes wrong is, these guys need to be prepared for life after boxing, because it's a very barren and hard landscape for them.
One last point to make on Ali. So, for instance, Bob Arum says that Ali had a family history of Parkinson's, and so did boxing compound it? Yes, but he said Ali's not a good example, for instance, of a punch-drunk fighter. It's worth putting that point in there. But Thomas Hauser, I think, made a really astute observation, and I guess it's going to be a central part of maybe our discussion for the rest of the interview and as we talk about the future of boxing. So he said, for Ali, by definition, if he was advocating for boxers with CTE, then he would have been advocating against boxing. And that's almost the central problem here in a sport where, unlike rugby, where head trauma is an unfortunate consequence of the point of the sport. In boxing, the point of the sport is to concuss your opponent effectively. And so that is obviously the tricky conclusion Ali possibly realized as well. If I'm going to advocate massively here for boxers with CTE, it becomes difficult for me not to advocate in a large way against boxing.
I can see that, Joe. And I think I've become a lot more content with my stance on boxing since I've said the fights are the fights. You can't really change that. You can maybe change the medical personnel ringside as to who's best placed to work the fights. You can maybe change some of the things about weight making and different things and guys fighting in the weight class. There's those things. But fights are the fights. And, I don't think there's going to be stuff in terms of tampering with round lengths or with glove sizes and stuff. I think, and that means we will always have CTE. But when you think of the exposure and when you think of Ali, Ali obviously dined out and these guys had these war stories from being in Deer Lake with these top contenders and doing 10, 15 rounds of going to war with these guys, with young guys like Larry Holmes, a future champion, Mike Weaver, Michael Dokes, Tim Witherspoon. They were going up there and Ali was laying on the ropes and letting them pound away at him. And then when you speak to Mickey Ward, who's obviously later in the book, he reckons, I think 90% of his damage was done in sparring.
Yeah.
So I think, there's certain ways to mitigate the risks. So the fights are the fights and they're going to be left alone. And that will, if you just find, just say, for instance, imagine if Mickey, just all he had was the fights and he took out 90% of his exposure, chances are he'd be way better than he is today. And you could say the same thing with Muhammad. If he just had the fights and hadn't had the weeks upon weeks of sparring, 2, 3, 4, 5 times a week, and hadn't taken that abuse. And I think when you look at today's day and age as well, some of these guys are coming out of the amateurs with 300 fights. I mean, is that really necessary to have 300 fights? I don't know. I think the amount of exposure that people put themselves out for is asking for trouble, for sure. And I think that can all be mitigated. So it doesn't have to be, and I was very aware of this when I did the book, Joe, that people were going to say, it should be banned anyway. And they were going to make it the argument for the abolition of the sport. And it wasn't about that. It's about trying to say, look, this is the problem. This is what we've got. Here are some solutions. And it's easy to reduce that exposure. And it really is very, very simple.
Yeah.
it means changing a bit of the culture and not making it quite so macho. And it also means a lot of education and raising awareness about the long-term damage. Because you said about at the start of this interview with, it's sort of like the untold story, but we all know about it. I think too many people think about acute brain injuries and what might happen on fight night. People think about Gerald McClellan, they think about Michael Watson, they think about Benny Kid Paret, and they think about the tragedies. But, I haven't mentioned any of those guys in the book because that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the long, slow deaths that happen when someone starts to change at about the age of 40 and 45 and 50, and they start to deteriorate and it gets worse year on year on year. That's, that's the chronic injuries and the chronic illnesses it leads to that I'm discussing in the book. And I think the acute injuries people have been aware of for a long time, but the chronic stuff, people think, oh, it's not going to happen to me, and they think it's a roll of the dice. They think, no, it's just not going to happen to me. It's happened to them. But if you have a lot of exposure, the chances are you can't deny the science.
Because to draw again or extend the parallel with, say, rugby or NFL, they're not perfect parallels, but they suit as working examples. Certainly in rugby, we're seeing contact and training going right down in comparison with, say, early 2000s when rugby was really trying to be professional and thinking, well, what do we do here? Well, we have to train like dogs every day. And also NFL, contact and training has come down massively. So I suppose for boxing, I mean, let's deal in realities here. Just banning a sport like boxing, something so almost hardwired in and primeval, like it'll go underground, and you don't want that to happen either. Like I suspect there'll be something in human beings where they want to fight, and so regulating it is probably the smarter thing to do. And also, just with so much money at stake and everything else, and it's so established, how it would be banned. I can't.
And
really
also,
see that
you can't ban boxing and keep MMA, and all that different stuff,
and
once you ban all the contact sports. Then.
Yeah, there'll always be the next thing in line. If you ban one, you got to ban the other. So I guess you got to work within trying to make the thing safer. And so two things jump out to me. One, informed consent. And so letting everybody know the risks. And that's where something like your book is very helpful. And then secondly, as you said, how do we change training? How do we make this thing safer for the vast majority of the time? Like you talked to Freddie Roach, it was pretty interesting. And, he was talking about sparring and how often it might need to be done. And to be fair to him, I loved his honesty, because he said, well, look, you still need to spar. You still need to practice measuring distance and fighting, but you don't necessarily need to do it as often as he was doing it in the 80s.
Yeah, of course. Freddie's I hate to use it, but he's one of the poster boys for Parkinson's now, isn't he? Because he's had such a long, high profile fight with it. It's a tough one. I mean, there's, in terms of the informed consent thing, is I find fascinating at the moment, because my son's 15 and he plays soccer. And so obviously I'm an old school guy. I'm very far from being a woke individual. But when a big high ball goes up, obviously I've got the proud dad thinking, go on, son, get your head on it. And there's also part of me saying, just let it bounce and kick it. And when informed consent comes in, I spoke to Chris Nowinski at the Concussion Legacy Foundation for the book. Yeah. He thinks that within 10 years of me going there, so it was a couple of years ago now, that children won't be able to head footballs under the age of 14. So obviously, what does that mean for boxing, where you can actually fight from the age of 11? And I think there's some stats in the book where our 2008 Olympian Tony Jeffries talks about the amount of times he was hitting the head before the age of 12. I think there's a big thing about informed consent, because, knowing what I know, I wouldn't have allowed my son to box before the age of 14 to the head. I still think there's a real space for boxing in schools and in communities. I think there's so much to be gained from being able to box. My daughter's 12 now, and I would love for her to have friends or something in a school where she puts pads on and takes someone on the pads, and then they swap over and she puts the gloves on and does that. I think that will really help her self-respect. It will help her self-discipline. Not that there's anything wrong with any of her current attributes, but self-respect, self-discipline, and confidence. And I feel the same thing for my son. I think, and boxing training allows that sort of discipline and self-discipline to kick in. You'll still see some retired fighters or guys who've retired, and they're in immaculate shape because it's now ingrained in them. They get up, they run, and it's part of routine and part of their habits, and it's given them a long and healthy life. But the informed consent thing is a very interesting point to make, particularly when you're looking at kids and when you're factor in other sports and how they're changing. I think the thing is with boxing, it's tough, isn't it? Because how do you police this stuff? How do you get into the gyms where the culture is to be macho? How do you get into this thing where there's been so many precedents set where people, it was funny. I don't know if you remember when Anthony Joshua lost to Andy Ruiz. There was headlines a few weeks down the line saying Rob McCracken, his trainer, let him box on with a concussion.
Yeah.
Well, obviously, Chris Nowinski says in the book, well, realistically, if you're giving anyone a 10 count, and Joshua went down in the fight, was given a 10 count, you're writing concussion into the rules. Because, they must be concussed or nearly concussed. They need 10 seconds to regain their senses.
Yeah.
Maybe it's a mild concussion or a mild TBI, traumatic brain injury, but concussion nonetheless. So yeah, it's a very difficult thing in terms of the sport, and it's not one of those sports like we've mentioned with soccer and football where it's like, oh, you've got a head injury, off you come, we'll put someone else on. You're either in or you're out.
That's a great point. And that's where you get to the really sticky, uncomfortable part of the conversation for boxing, because of the inherent nature of it. Like you said, in rugby, HIA, off you go, no chances taken, done. You mentioned Joshua there, and you have it in the book. He quips afterwards and says, well, what's a concussion? So do you have a sport where you're knocked down and count to 8 and you get back up and you kind of shake and I'm okay? By rights, I mean, Chris Nowinski's right. That's probably a concussion more often than not. So that should be end of the fight. And yet,
yeah, well, I mean, Chris says these two things. I think he says, obviously punches to the body, would be a 10 count. But also he did say, and these are Chris's words, not mine, said maybe a 3 count, where almost like a flash knockdown, you get up, shake off, you're actually fine, and you can go again. But yeah, I mean, for me, in terms of where I'm at, like I said, the fights are the fights. I think there's so much that could be done to reduce exposure behind closed doors with sparring, the amount of fights you're having as an amateur and that kind of stuff. I think that's where the work needs to be done to look after these guys.
It's certainly the first step. And again, you hate to talk about people in this way, but so say, I guess, the aspiration for boxing should be as quickly as possible to ensure that training has been done in as safe a way as possible. And then, unfortunately, there's a degree of guinea pig generation to see, well, where does that leave the next generation of fighters who have markedly brought down their sparring, but they are taking punishment in fights? Where are they when they're in their 60s and 70s? And then you may have to recalibrate again. Like, it's a kind of a chilling way to talk about human beings. And that's where informed consent comes in a big way. But like, that's where probably boxing is, in that it has to recalibrate and then wait and see, and maybe recalibrate again and wait and see.
But it's a massive thing to do with the culture, and also to do with boxing, and it's something we talk about in Life After Boxing. How do the fighters replace the high of the buzz of not just fight night, but of sparring and that competition? And there was this well-documented case, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Nick Blackwell, who was hurt by George Groves in sparring about a week before he fought Chris Eubank Jr., who subsequently put Blackwell in a coma on fight night.
Yes.
And Nick fought for his life and made a brilliant recovery, and he was as fit as a fiddle, and rowing and cycling and running, and then he sparred again months and months down the line, and he sustained a far worse brain injury than the first time, and he was left far worse than he was having been given a second chance. And then, so that you think, oh, well, that's an isolated incident. That's someone not being particularly wise with the hand they've been dealt. Then, however, I've just gone and done a podcast with Kieran Farrell, who was a Manchester fighter who was who had to retire after suffering a brain injury against Anthony Crolla back in, I think, about 2012. And Kieran actually was sparring. He'd gone back sparring and told him what shouldn't be doing anything again. He'd gone back sparring years down the line, and it was actually only what happened to Nick Blackwell that stopped him. And he said, "No, geez, I'm not doing it anymore." And so, but these are the fighters. These are what we're dealing with. And it's not. I'm not saying that they're stupid, because that's not what I'm saying. But they can't give up the rush. They can't replace the rush and that spirit of competition. it's what it, to an extent it's all they know, but to the larger extent it's their passion, it's what they love to do.
And there's money. I mean, it's the best. I mean, they're never, you know, they won't make as much money in any other area of life in a lot of cases.
Yeah, it's a tough one. I mean, one of the great examples of this is Tony Jeffries, who I mentioned earlier, who's now become like a social media influencer, who's done fantastically well by doing online boxing tutorials on YouTube and all the rest of it. And he had to retire after 9 fights with damaged hands, and he thinks he's dodged a massive bullet. Now he's part of a brain study in Las Vegas. And he's done very well for himself. So yeah, the guys might not see that they've got options out there, but Tony felt like that at the start. He's created his own avenues, and he's still got a long life to lead. There's nothing to stop these guys going out, and maybe that needs to be part of the education from trainers, where when you pack this up at 30, 35, you've got a long life ahead of you. You can't just keep putting on the old DVDs or watching your old fights back on YouTube for the next 40 years. You've got a life to lead.
Tris, your book addresses another important point here, and that is, and it links into the Ali story we mentioned earlier, in that you could be refused a license in one jurisdiction and you will get one elsewhere. And you talk about how John McCain, before he fell ill, was pushing for like a national boxing commission, and some of the people you speak to make the point that publicly everyone was saying, "Oh yeah, very sensible, good idea." But there was real pushback behind the scenes because people want power. And it was kind of less than promising, I think, outlook that I got from the book anyway, that this is likely to come into existence. One jurisdiction, some kind of national commission whereby you can't just go off and get licensed willy-nilly elsewhere, because I guess the point is, who wants to give up their piece of the pie?
Well, that's the thing, Joe, as well. It's not even just a national commission. You need an international commission, and we've had this. When Derek Chisora and David Haye didn't fight under a British license because of their antics in Munich, when they had that sort of mini riot and they ended up throwing glasses and all sorts at each other, they took out Luxembourg boxing licenses and fought in this country. And people from a slightly more serious standpoint, people have been denied licenses on medical grounds in one state in America, and they've gone and got a license in another state because the parameters are different. I was speaking to promoter Lou DiBella last night. He said some states you just need an eye test and a blood test and you're good to go, as long as you can see what you're doing and you're not going to give anyone any lethal illnesses or diseases. You're fine. Which is terrifying. But obviously the book also takes into account that some states you need to have an MRI scan to box, some states you need a CAT scan, some states you need both, and some states you don't need either. So that's just one country. So the loopholes are staggering. And there's numerous fighters who, when they reach the end of the line and they can't fight in Las Vegas or Atlantic City, where the commissions are slightly stricter, will then go and take short chains in Latvia or Germany or somewhere else, or Australia. And that's the nature of the business, and these people say, and then they're marketed, they're saying, oh, this former champion, is decorated former champion, but the guy hasn't won in 5 years, and they're still just selling the guy's name. And it's tragic, really, because it's the ultimate taking advantage of people, because these fighters are desperate, and these people are desperate to get a foot into the sport, because they're all looking at that big payday at the end and getting involved at the highest end of boxing. And obviously only a few chosen, few get there, but yeah, I mean, an international commission would be fantastic, particularly if you could share brain scans where the centralized database, so that you could track changes over time in a fighter's brain. You could start to flag whether you saw white matter or any massive change in the MRIs. You could start to flag it and make these guys aware of the problems they might face down the line. But again, this is one of the problems where there's patient-client confidentiality. So if you go and fail a brain scan and you're part of a study, for instance, the people can't then tell the commission, because you got. And if if your doctor says you can't fight, you might go and blag it with the commission, and they'll never know. And then you've got to look at other things as well. When we have a lot of fighters come over here from Latvia, and you think, when the Mexican fighters come and fill the undercards in America, how many of the commissioners know whether these guys have got slurred speech when they don't speak the language? And how many of them know what these guys spoke like 5 or 6 years ago? Can they track the change over time, or do they just think, stamp the ticket and let them fight? It's how do you police all this stuff? And It's very difficult when you think of pulling it all in place. It is difficult, but then also when you think that probably the top 1% of the sport make 99% of the money, there are probably influencers out there with enough power to get something over the line, but it's going to have to be the top people, because that's where all the money is. It's fine for the people who wish boxing well and want it to thrive, like myself, or promoter Lou DiBella, or Dr. Margaret Goodman, or trainer like Teddy Atlas. But really the money is with your Hearns, your Joshuas, your Mayweathers, your George Foremans, your Tysons, and if those guys aren't inclined to do it, and why would they? Because they're in an individual sport looking after themselves. Why? What? How's it going to happen? I just don't know.
Yeah. We're talking here with Tris Dixon, whose new book is Damaged, the Untold Story of Brain Trauma in Boxing, if you're just tuning in. That's a bleak outlook you've just painted there, by the way. I don't see that changing anytime soon. That's too complicated, too many vested interests, too much politics, too much money at stake. Like, that sounds like one of the biggest problems facing boxing right now, and with no immediate or even medium-term solution, unfortunately.
Well, I think so. I think where there's a will, there's a way, Joe. And I think that's the thing. It has to be down to the people to want to make a change and to help these guys during and after their careers. And I think probably the most. So I have given this a bit of thought since the book came out, and I think the way to go would probably be for something like the British Boxing Board of Control to reach out to Nevada, for Nevada to reach out to New York, and for New York to reach out to another respected commission. And possibly I was going to say California, that's borderline now, but anyway, but basically to form a League of Nations and say, look, we're leading the way now, and we're going to have these policies. This is what we're doing to look after the fighters. We're going to host all the big fights now, and you're either sort of doing what we're doing, or you're not going to get the big fights.
As a matter of interest, why is California borderline now?
Well, they've sanctioned the Oscar De La Hoya fight. Now he's age 48 to box the MMA guy that he's boxing, and they've changed the rounds. I think they're making it 2-minute rounds, which is basically an admission that he shouldn't be boxing, because if he's fit to box and everything's hunky dory, why is he not boxing 3-minute rounds? And this is a guy who told me personally he was washed up, and he felt he washed up halfway through the Mayweather fight in 2007. We're 14 years on from there. So yeah, so California is on my must do better list at the minute.
Yeah, and like that's why I personally wouldn't have much optimism for the sport changing dramatically. I mean, we're coming up on the 100-year anniversary, aren't we, of that 1928 punch drunk paper? Like, this is not a new problem. The NFL have reacted very swiftly to CTE, and they've reacted for two reasons. One, because of the money they had to pay out and they don't want to do that again. And two, because unlike boxing, they have a total control over a limited number of people and limited number of franchises. So it's far more doable to overnight go, these are the regulations, this is how we're doing it, end of. And I don't know, where do you think we are if we're having this conversation in 20 years' time, realistically? Will much have changed?
Well, I think the concern is really that if we get this federal oversight and some sort of international commission, the problem is that a couple of fighters break away and do their own thing. Yeah. And then there's another commission, and then we'll be back to sort of it'd be Groundhog Day, where we're split, and there's multiple championships all over again and all that sort of stuff. So it's a tough one, Joe, isn't it? I think boxing is a sport that is set in its ways. I see it every day when I go to the gyms, and I see how the guys are training in it. They're training like it's 1950 again. There's even though there are more and more S&C guys having an impact, maybe with the higher level guys, there's still a lot of people doing very amateurish stuff in their training. And
in effect, taking too much punishment to the head, basically.
Yeah, but also, I'm talking about education in terms of nutrition and strength and conditioning and that kind of stuff. It's a sense that the sport is still in many ways in the dark ages. It hasn't really evolved with the times, and I think the structure's the same. And I've often thought about this actually since covering the sport, since about I first went to a fight in the late 90s, but it's not changed. The experience is the same. You know, it's not like where you go to football and things have changed. You've got big screens and you've got, you know, crowds being, you know, worked and sort of, you know, entertainment and stuff going on all the time and all the rest of it. Like the premise of boxing, it's very much the same and has been all the way through. There's very little evolution in there, despite we've had some major promoters come in along the way promising, you know, sweeping changes and, you know, we're going to take the sport into the next century and all the rest of it. And yet you go to a show now and it's still the same as ever, you know, with, you know, your walkout bouts and, you know, your floaters in between the main fights and, you know, the structure of the show and stuff. It's all very like as it was when I started in the sport nearly 30 years ago. It's all nearly the same.
Yeah.
So sorry, in answer to your question, I'm not sure it would have moved on a jot in 20 years.
Yeah. And like 20 years goes by very quickly, you know, and the older you get and you start thinking back 20 years ago isn't that far away. And yeah, things don't change as quickly as we think. So the other thing, it'd be remiss of me not to mention with the book, like it's very, very affecting when you go and talk to former boxers and their family and see where they are now. I mean, like it can sound a little bit like nanny state here, the way we're talking. And yet when you see the damage done, not to, no pun intended on the name of the book, but when you see where they are and just the damage it does to their quality of life, like it's just horrific. It's heartbreaking stuff. It's heartbreaking for them. It's heartbreaking for their family. I mean, a lot of them do seem to say to you, "I have no regrets and I do it all over again." But I don't know. I wonder about that sometimes. I think maybe you have to tell yourself that to get through the day. But look, maybe they do mean it, but it's a horrific vista. And if it's, you know, even some way avoidable, geez, like the sport has to start trying to avoid it.
Yeah, it's I agree, and you know, yes, certainly some of the bigger names I've spoken to in the book, or you know, spoken in association to, you know, people who are associated with them, whether it's Mickey Ward, Aaron Pryor, Muhammad Ali, and they all said if they could do it again, they would.
Yeah.
That's a very powerful sentiment, and I'm fully on board with that. But there are a few guys in the book who didn't make that kind of money and don't have those kind of reputations, and they have said, you know, if I knew then what I know now, I wouldn't have done it.
Mm.
So, you know, and those are equally powerful, but probably not quite as powerful in terms of the things where someone's damaged and they said, well, if I could do it again, I would. They sort of don't stand in the memory as much. But
No.
I've met quite a few fighters down the years that have regretted it. I remember there was a good example of that, actually. So I was very good friends with the former light heavyweight champ, Matthew Saad Mohammed, towards the end of his life. And I remember asking him at the International Boxing Hall of Fame once, do you have any regrets? And I knew Matthew was slowing up, and later he was diagnosed with ALS, and you could tell he had issues. And he said, no, I don't regret anything. And he was here at the Hall of Fame, and fans were flocking for autographs and photos and all the rest of it. And he said, no regrets at all. And then I remember a couple of years down the line, I was with him. I was actually staying in an apartment with him in Atlantic City, and it wasn't in a nice part of Atlantic City at all. And you know, he was broke, and it wasn't his apartment. We were staying at a friend of his, and I said, "Do you have any regrets?" The same question, and he said, "Yeah, I wish I'd been a singer or an actor, because then life wouldn't be like this." Mm. So it's funny because you get the two sides of it. You get the, you know, he one day, you know, when he was being appreciated for all the stuff he'd done, he wouldn't have changed a thing. But then when you know, remove him from the limelight and put him back in the cold light of day where his real life was, he would think, you know, I wish I hadn't bothered.
Yes. And it's not, and the book deals with this as well. Unfortunately, it's not possible for us to predict, well, how much punishment is the threshold, because every individual has different levels of likelihood of developing problems. Some might take more punishment than others, and vice versa, and develop problems and vice versa.
Yeah, that's one of the things, you know, that's why there's some brain studies being done now, and they're quite wide ranging, and they're in Boston, they're in Las Vegas and different places, and they're trying to work out how much is too much. And then, you know, one of the things that we haven't touched upon here, Joe, and for me, it's probably what I found most fascinating. When you look at what's happened in the American football stuff, and you look at the characters of the guys, whether it's guys who've committed suicide or committed murders or whatever, you know, obviously we've had our fair share of that in boxing over the years, is you don't know if this is linked to brain trauma. and they're changing their personality, which is one of the side effects, which causes depression, mood swings, and bad decision making, and all that kind of stuff. Or if it's the fact that a lot of these guys are born and come from trauma in the first place, and that's how they find their way into boxing, through extreme poverty or through some kind of family or ghetto trauma. And it's tough because that's what some of the studies are trying to get to the bottom of. So were some of these guys destined to fly off the rails? Were some of them born with criminal minds, or were they just regular guys, but their brains were mangled by the sport? It's so hard to know. And it's the same thing with American football. When you talk about Aaron Hernandez, who obviously was a star of a Netflix, a star in inverted commas, obviously, of a Netflix documentary, and committed a couple of murders. It's, was that American football? Did the guy have a criminal mind? Obviously, I'm not limiting it just to boxing. But yeah, I find this fascinating. And, you can see some fighters do change over time. But, studies need to get to the bottom of this, and how the changes come in, and where and when and how.
Yeah. It's a very complicated, nuanced point you make there. Yeah. And it's so interesting. I guess to finish up in the epilogue, like you do stress, I mean, and it's a very sober assessment of the history of the sport when it comes to CTE. You do say that this book is not about the abolition of boxing, and you stress that it's very much your opinion, boxing has saved more souls than it's taken. For instance, it's been a way out of poverty for so many. It's provided discipline and the various attributes you mentioned when you were talking about your daughter. It's transformed lives. But I do get the impression from the epilogue, and this is the question, that you do feel, if we're being brutal about it, boxing is largely ignoring the problem.
Oh God, yeah. Yeah, and I don't think it even knows it's got a problem to a large extent.
Right.
I think it's terrifying, but you can't. It's undeniable for me. I've been to countless ex-boxer galas and Hall of Fame meetings and stuff, and you can spot the fighters a mile away. I'll go to Freddie Roach's gym. It's a good example, actually. I went to Freddie Roach's gym a couple of years ago. I was doing some work for BT Sport. And you could tell by a guy, by not just by his face and, whether he's got a flat nose or scar tissue over his eyes, you can tell by he walks or how he moves that he used to be a fighter. So I said to someone, who's that guy in the corner? Because I knew he was a fighter. I could tell. The guy was about probably 60 years old, but I could tell he'd been in the sport all that time. And, people who have been in boxing a long time do get a trained eye. I've spoken to a few people, whether it's journalists or promoters or other fighters. You do get, you get a keen eye for this sort of stuff. And it's sad, but this is one of the sad things, Joe. Generally people shrug their shoulders and they don't really know what to say, and the fighter might not understand what's exactly going on with him, so you can't really say, oh, have you got CTE?
Yes.
And you don't go up to him and say, are you punch drunk? Because that's like one of the biggest insult in the sport. So how do you address it? How do you start to tackle it? And I think so. I know I quoted a reasonably extensive conversation in the epilogue there with some of the fighters talking about on social media. I think that kind of stuff is vital. So that people are, there's a couple of threads that I included there where ex-fighters who didn't quite make it to the top but had reasonable careers were talking about the after effects of their careers, whether it was being unable to get jobs or hold down a job, or suffering from headaches, or short-term memory loss and that kind of stuff. And it's great that it's out in the open because it needs to be discussed.
Yeah.
The ultimate thing with the book for me really is to try and make people comfortable talking about the uncomfortable. Would I ideally want to spend 45 minutes talking to you, Joe, with all due respect, about something that would be seen as a negative interpretation on the sport that I love? Probably not.
Yeah.
Because I don't want to be seen as a guy fueling the fire for guys that want to lose the sport altogether. But I do think that the sport can do more and should do more to help the fighters, because ultimately without the fighters, we've got nothing. So give them a little bit more, give them a little bit more dignity, give them a little bit more hope and ambition for when they retire. And it's easy enough to do. It just is going to take some work.
Listen, great having you on the show again. The book is Damaged, the Untold Story of Brain Trauma in Boxing. It's by Tris Dixon. 4 years work has gone into it. Tris, thanks so much. Lovely to have you on the show again.
Thanks, Joe. Always a pleasure.